A single pill tumbles across the narrow aisle of Flight 727, its white surface catching the harsh cabin lights before disappearing beneath row 12. The medication that 16-year-old Grant Thompson desperately needs for his asthma lies shattered, trampled by the very person sworn to ensure passenger safety. Rebecca Martinez stands over the destruction she has caused, her polyester uniform crisp with authority, her smile cold with satisfaction. "Security regulations," she announces loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "No unauthorized medications allowed." Her voice carries the weight of someone who believes rules exist to be wielded like weapons. The other passengers shift uncomfortably, some reaching for their phones to capture what unfolds, but none yet brave enough to intervene. Grant clutches his chest, his breathing already becoming labored. The irony is lost on Rebecca. In her zealous pursuit of protocol, she has created the very emergency she claims to prevent. But what she doesn't know, what none of them know, is that the quiet man in seat 42F isn't just another passenger. Admiral David Thompson watches his son's humiliation unfold, and his silence carries the weight of storms yet to come. Grant Thompson carries himself with the quiet dignity his parents instilled in him. At 16, he understands the delicate navigation required of young black men in spaces where their presence is questioned. He boards the aircraft with practiced politeness, nodding respectfully to the flight crew, storing his carry-on with careful precision. The inhaler in his jacket pocket represents more than medication. It's his lifeline, prescribed since childhood for asthma that, while manageable, can turn serious without warning. The flight from Atlanta to Denver carries him toward his grandmother's bedside. 83-year-old Eleanor Thompson lies in Presbyterian St. Joseph Medical Center, her condition deteriorating. Grant travels alone because his father, Admiral David Thompson, is already en route from a naval conference in Norfolk. The family reunion will happen at the hospital, but first Grant must complete this journey. As the plane begins its taxi toward the runway, Grant feels the familiar tightness in his chest. It's nothing alarming. Stress often triggers mild episodes. He reaches for his inhaler with the same casual motion another passenger might adjust their seatbelt. The blue plastic device emerges from his jacket, its familiar weight reassuring in his palm. Rebecca Martinez notices immediately. 8 years of flying has taught her to scan for irregularities, though her definition of irregular skews heavily towards suspicion rather than service. She watches the teenage boy handle what appears to be some kind of device, her mind already cataloguing violations and protocols. Rebecca's career trajectory speaks volumes about her character. 12 formal complaints in 8 years, 2 suspensions for passenger altercations, and a reputation among colleagues for escalating situations rather than diffusing them. "Excuse me?" Rebecca approaches with the bearing of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "What is that in your hand?" Grant looks up, his expression open and respectful. "It's my inhaler, Mom, for asthma." He holds the device where she can see it clearly, the prescription label visible on its side. The medication inside represents years of careful management, doctor's visits, and his mother's vigilant attention to his respiratory health. Rebecca's eyes narrow. In her worldview, explanations from passengers, especially young passengers, especially young black passengers, represent challenges to her authority rather than simple communication. "Hand it over," she demands, extending her palm with the expectation of immediate compliance. "I'm sorry." Grant's confusion is genuine. "Mom, this is prescribed medication. I have my doctor's note in my backpack if you need to see it. The offer of documentation should end the interaction." Federal aviation regulations clearly permit prescribed medications in carry-on luggage. Rebecca knows this, but knowledge and application are different things in her world. "I don't care what papers you think you have," she snaps. "Unauthorized devices aren't allowed during takeoff." Other passengers begin to notice the escalating tension. Mrs. Chen in seat 14A starts recording on her phone, sensing something worth documenting. The businessman in 10C looks up from his laptop, frowning at the unnecessary commotion. But airplane social dynamics favor authority figures, and passengers typically avoid confrontation at 30,000 feet. "Ma'am, with respect, this isn't a device. It's medicine." Grant maintains his composure despite the growing absurdity of the situation. His parents taught him to remain calm in difficult situations, to explain clearly and rely on logic to prevail. "I've flown with this medication many times before." Rebecca's frustration mounts with each word Grant speaks. In her mental framework, compliance should be immediate and unquestioning. The boy's continued explanations represent defiance, his calm demeanor evidence of disrespect. "Are you arguing with me?" she asks, her voice rising enough to draw attention from surrounding rows. "No, ma'am, I'm just explaining." "Give me that thing right now!" Rebecca reaches for the inhaler, her movement quick and aggressive. Grant pulls back instinctively, protecting his medication from her grasping fingers. The motion further inflames Rebecca's anger, confirming in her mind that this passenger poses some kind of threat. "Please don't take my medicine," Grant says, his voice carrying the first note of real concern. "I need it for breathing problems." Rebecca's response reveals the depth of her callousness. "I don't care what you think you need. This is my airplane, and I decide what's allowed." With a swift motion, she snatches the inhaler from Grant's grasp. The boy's reflexive attempt to protect his medication fails against Rebecca's determined aggression. What happens next will haunt Rebecca Martinez for the rest of her life. Instead of examining the clearly labeled prescription device, instead of checking for proper documentation, instead of exercising the basic human decency expected of service professionals, she demonstrates the cruelty that power without wisdom enables. Rebecca holds the inhaler high enough for multiple rows to see, then deliberately drops it to the cabin floor. The plastic device hits the carpeted aisle with a sound that seems disproportionately loud in the confined space. But Rebecca isn't finished. With calculated malice, she raises her regulation shoe and brings it down hard on the inhaler, crushing the plastic chamber that contains Grant's medication. The canister inside ruptures with a small hiss, releasing albuterol into the recycled cabin air. The destruction of Grant's medication creates a moment of stunned silence that reverberates through the cabin like a shockwave. Passengers who witnessed Rebecca's deliberate act sit frozen, their minds struggling to process what they've just seen. The casual cruelty of the moment, the way she smiled while destroying a teenager's medicine, cuts through the usual airplane etiquette that keeps travelers isolated in their own concerns. Grant stares at the crushed remains of his inhaler, the blue plastic fragments scattered across the industrial carpeting like broken promises. His chest tightens, but now the sensation carries psychological weight alongside the physical symptoms. The medicine that has protected him for years lies destroyed by the very person supposedly ensuring his safety. "There," Rebecca announces with satisfaction, brushing her hands together as if completing a satisfying task. "No unauthorized devices on my aircraft." Her voice carries the tone of someone who believes she has solved a problem rather than created a crisis. The destroyed inhaler represents, in her mind, a successful application of airline security protocols. That was my medicine, Grant says quietly, his voice carrying disbelief rather than anger. Even now, his parents' lessons about remaining respectful in confrontational situations guide his response. I need that for my asthma. Rebecca's reaction reveals the depths of her prejudice and professional incompetence. Don't try to manipulate me with sob stories, she snaps. If you were really sick, you wouldn't be flying alone. Her logic demonstrates not just callousness, but a fundamental misunderstanding of medical conditions, travel requirements, and basic human dignity. The passengers around them begin to react more visibly. Mrs. Chen's phone captures Rebecca's dismissive response, while the businessman in 10C shakes his head in obvious disgust. A woman traveling with her own teenage daughter moves to comfort Grant, but Rebecca immediately intervenes. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," Rebecca orders the concerned passenger. This situation is under control. The woman hesitates, torn between basic human decency and the unwritten rules of airline compliance. Rebecca's authority uniform carries weight that most people instinctively respect, even when wielded inappropriately. Grant attempts to retrieve the broken pieces of his inhaler, kneeling in the aisle to gather the plastic fragments. The sight of the teenager scrambling to collect the remains of his destroyed medication creates a powerful visual that several passengers capture on their devices. Rebecca watches his efforts with obvious disdain. "Leave that trash where it is," she commands. "Housekeeping will clean it up later." The casual reference to life-saving medication as trash provides another glimpse into Rebecca's mindset. To her, Grant's medical needs represent inconvenience rather than emergency. Grant's breathing becomes noticeably more labored as stress compounds his underlying condition. The psychological impact of the situation, the public humiliation, the destruction of his safety net, the hostile authority figure, triggers exactly the kind of episode his medication was designed to prevent. "Please," Grant says, his voice now carrying a slight wheeze. "I need to call my father. He can explain about the medicine." Rebecca's response demonstrates how power without accountability corrupts even simple interactions. "You're not calling anyone," she declares, reaching for Grant's phone as he attempts to dial. All devices must be in airplane mode during taxi and takeoff. The selective application of regulations, strictly enforced against Grant while other passengers openly use their phones to record the incident, reveals her true motivations. The struggle for the phone creates another moment of physical confrontation. Grant, trained to respect authority but also aware of his deteriorating condition, tries to protect his communication lifeline. Rebecca, emboldened by previous successful aggression, attempts to confiscate the device. The tussle, brief but visible to surrounding passengers, further demonstrates the flight attendant's willingness to escalate rather than de-escalate. "Air Marshal!" Rebecca suddenly shouts toward the front of the cabin. "I need assistance with a disruptive passenger." The call for backup represents a calculated escalation, transforming Grant from medical patient to security threat through the simple power of narrative control. Two passengers in official-looking blazers move towards the commotion. The Federal Air Marshals aboard Flight 727 have been watching the interaction with growing concern, but Rebecca's official call for assistance forces their intervention. Their approach shifts the dynamic from customer service dispute to potential law enforcement situation. "What seems to be the problem?" asks Marshal Jennifer Rodriguez, her trained eyes quickly assessing the scene. The broken plastic on the floor, the teenage boy obviously struggling to breathe, and the agitated flight attendant present a complex picture that requires careful navigation. Rebecca immediately launches into her version of events, her words carefully chosen to paint Grant as the aggressor. This passenger was carrying an unauthorized device and became combative when I confiscated it for security reasons. He's been arguing with me and disturbing other passengers. The marshal turns to Grant, whose labored breathing now provides obvious evidence of medical distress. Son, can you tell me what happened here? Grant struggles to speak between difficult breaths. She destroyed my inhaler. He manages. Asthma medication, prescribed by my doctor. Marshal Rodriguez examines the broken plastic on the floor, her experience quickly identifying the remains of a standard medical inhaler. The prescription label, though damaged, remains partially legible. Her expression hardens as she realizes the situation's true nature. Mom? The marshal addresses Rebecca. This appears to be prescribed medication. Can you explain why it was destroyed? Rebecca's confidence wavers slightly under professional scrutiny, but her commitment to her narrative remains firm. Security protocols require confiscation of unauthorized devices. The passenger became aggressive when I enforced standard regulations. The marshal's radio crackles with an incoming message from the cockpit. Marshal Rodriguez, please report to the flight deck immediately. We have priority communication from air traffic control. The cryptic message adds another layer of tension to an already volatile situation. As Marshal Rodriguez moves toward the cockpit, Grant's condition continues to deteriorate. His breathing becomes increasingly shallow, his complexion taking on a grayish pallor that trained medical personnel would recognize as serious respiratory distress. Rebecca, perhaps finally recognizing the medical emergency she has created, attempts to shift responsibility. If he's really having breathing problems, maybe he shouldn't have been flying, she says to the remaining passengers, as if Grant's presence on the aircraft represents the problem rather than her destruction of his medication. The captain's voice comes over the intercom, his words carefully measured but carrying obvious tension. Ladies and gentlemen, we're returning to the gate due to an operational issue. Please remain in your seats with seat belts fastened. The announcement triggers immediate speculation among passengers. Flight returns to the gate typically indicate serious problems, mechanical issues, security threats, or medical emergencies. The timing, coming immediately after Rebecca's confrontation with Grant, seems unlikely to be coincidental. Grant attempts to stand, his legs unsteady from oxygen deprivation. The teenager who boarded with quiet confidence now struggles with basic mobility, the destruction of his medication creating a cascade of medical complications that worsen by the minute. "Sit down!" Rebecca barks, apparently viewing Grant's medical distress as continued defiance. All passengers must remain seated during taxi operations. But her authority is about to face a challenge she never anticipated. The call from air traffic control reaches the cockpit of Flight 727 with the weight of federal authority. Captain Michael Harrison, a veteran pilot with 23 years of commercial aviation experience, receives the message that will transform his routine Denver flight into career-defining crisis management. "Captain Harrison!" The voice from Atlanta Tower carries unusual urgency. "We have instructions from FAA headquarters regarding your passenger manifest. Confirm presence of Admiral David Thompson, military identification Delta 77 Alpha 9er. Harrison's hands pause over his controls as he processes the implications. Military passenger notifications typically involve routine courtesies or protocol requirements. The direct involvement of FAA headquarters suggests something far more serious. "Confirmed. Admiral Thompson is passenger 42F. May I ask the nature of the inquiry?" The response from air traffic control carries the weight of federal bureaucracy in motion. Admiral Thompson has filed an emergency complaint regarding discriminatory treatment and destruction of medical equipment affecting his minor son. You're directed to return to gate immediately for federal investigation. The words hit Captain Harrison like a physical blow. In his decades of flying, he has witnessed passenger disputes, medical emergencies, and security incidents. But federal investigations involving high-ranking military officials represent career-threatening territory that requires immediate damage control. Roger, returning to gate. Harrison confirms, his professional training maintaining calm communication despite internal panic. Requesting priority taxi clearance and ground support personnel, Marshal Rodriguez receives the cockpit summons with growing unease. Her quick briefing from Captain Harrison reveals the scope of the crisis developing behind the galley curtain. The disruptive passenger, identified by Rebecca Martinez, is the son of a United States admiral. Not just any admiral, but Admiral David Thompson, current deputy chairman of the National Aviation Security Committee, and the man whose recommendations shape federal aviation policy. How long has Admiral Thompson been aboard? Rodriguez asks, checking her passenger security briefing. Boarded in Atlanta, seat 42F, traveling under standard protocol. Harrison responds. No special notifications, no security detail. He's flying commercial like any other passenger. The marshal's mind races through the implications. Admiral Thompson's presence on the flight, combined with his son's treatment by airline personnel, creates a perfect storm of accountability that reaches to the highest levels of transportation security. Military officials with oversight authority over civilian aviation don't file emergency complaints lightly. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Admiral David Thompson sits with the disciplined stillness that characterizes military bearing under stress. For the past 20 minutes, he has watched his son's humiliation unfold from 30 rows away, his trained mind recording every detail while his father's heart burns with controlled fury. At 52, Admiral Thompson commands respect through competence rather than volume. His naval career spans 5 major conflicts, numerous humanitarian missions, and critical policy development that shapes American aviation security. The gray at his temples and the lines around his eyes speak to decades of responsibility, but his posture remains straight, his gaze alert, his hands steady. He has maintained radio silence not from indifference, but from strategic patience. Admiral Thompson understands power dynamics better than most, the difference between authority and effectiveness, between reaction and response, between winning battles and winning wars. His son's crisis requires surgical precision rather than emotional escalation. The Admiral's phone shows 17 missed calls from FAA headquarters, 8 from Pentagon liaison officers, and dozens of text messages from colleagues who monitor aviation incidents involving military personnel. News of the situation has already reached Washington through channels that bypass normal airline customer service protocols. His security clearance provides access to real-time flight monitoring systems that most passengers can't imagine. Admiral Thompson knows the aircraft's exact position, the captain's service record, the marshal's training background, and Rebecca Martinez's employment history, including her previous disciplinary actions and passenger complaints. More importantly, he knows the regulatory framework that governs every aspect of commercial aviation. As deputy chairman of the National Aviation Security Committee, Admiral Thompson helped draft the current protocols that Rebecca claims to enforce. Her actions don't just violate airline policy. They contradict federal regulations he personally authored. The Admiral's strategic patience reaches its limit as Grant's condition visibly deteriorates. Years of military training in crisis management tell him that immediate intervention now serves both his son's medical needs and the broader accountability required by the situation. Marshal Rodriguez approaches Admiral Thompson's seat with the careful deference reserved for high-ranking officials. Admiral Thompson, I'm Federal Air Marshal Rodriguez. I understand there's been an incident involving your son. The Admiral's response carries the quiet authority that subordinates recognize immediately. Marshal Rodriguez, my son's prescribed medication was deliberately destroyed by flight attendant Rebecca Martinez. The incident was recorded by multiple passengers and represents a clear violation of federal aviation medical accommodation requirements. His voice never rises above conversational level, but every word carries the weight of official documentation. Admiral Thompson doesn't make accusations. He states facts with the precision of someone accustomed to congressional testimony and Pentagon briefings. Sir, we're investigating the situation. The captain has been notified, and we're returning to the gate for further assessment. Admiral Thompson stands with deliberate purpose, his movement commanding immediate attention from surrounding passengers. At 6 feet 2 inches, with the bearing that comes from decades of military command, his presence shifts the entire cabin dynamic. Conversations halt, phones lower, all eyes focus on the unfolding drama. Marshal Rodriguez, I'm proceeding to check on my son's medical condition. Please inform Ms. Martinez that her actions are now subject to federal investigation under Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically Section 121305 regarding medical equipment accommodation. The specific regulatory citation demonstrates Admiral Thompson's intimate knowledge of aviation law. He doesn't threaten, he informs. The difference creates far more anxiety for those who understand the implications. Rebecca Martinez first notices the approaching figure from her position near the galley. The tall man walking purposefully down the aisle carries himself with obvious authority, but she assumes he represents another passenger overstepping boundaries. Her recent success in handling the disruptive teenager has reinforced her sense of control over the situation. "Sir, please return to your seat," she calls out, stepping into the aisle to block Admiral Thompson's path. "We're preparing for taxi operations, and all passengers must remain seated." Admiral Thompson stops directly in front of Rebecca, his calm gaze meeting her aggressive posture. The contrast between his disciplined composure and her defensive hostility creates a visual that passengers immediately recognize as significant. "Ms. Martinez," he says, his voice carrying the same measured tone he uses in Pentagon briefings. "I am Admiral David Thompson, Deputy Chairman of the National Aviation Security Committee, and the young man whose medication you destroyed is my son." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her face drains of color as the implications cascade through her consciousness. The disruptive teenager she publicly humiliated is the son of one of the most powerful men in American aviation security. The unauthorized device she destroyed belonged to the child of someone who helps write the regulations she claimed to enforce. That's not... I was following protocol," she stammers, her previous confidence evaporating under the weight of accountability she never anticipated. Admiral Thompson's response demonstrates the difference between institutional power and personal vendetta. "Ms. Martinez, federal regulations clearly permit prescribed medical devices in aircraft cabins. The medication you destroyed was legally prescribed for a documented medical condition. Your actions endangered my son's health and violated multiple federal statutes that I helped author." The cabin falls into complete silence as passengers process the revelation. The quiet man in 42F isn't just another traveler. He's one of the officials who shapes the very industry they're traveling within. Rebecca's routine enforcement has become a federal case involving someone with direct oversight authority over her employer. Captain Harrison's voice returns to the intercom, his words more urgent than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expediting our return to the gate. Federal ground personnel will be boarding to address a serious policy violation. Thank you for your patience." The announcement confirms what observant passengers already understand. This situation has escalated beyond normal airline customer service into federal investigation territory. Rebecca Martinez, who began the flight confident in her authority over passengers, now faces accountability to powers she never imagined. The aircraft's return to the gate triggers a cascade of consequences that Rebecca Martinez watches unfold with growing horror. Through the small cabin windows, she can see the unusual activity on the tarmac. Multiple official vehicles, personnel in federal identification badges, and the kind of coordinated response typically reserved for serious security incidents. Captain Harrison emerges from the cockpit with the grim expression of someone whose routine flight has become a career-defining crisis. His 23 years of commercial aviation experience have taught him to recognize when situations spiral beyond normal operational parameters. The presence of FAA investigators, airport security supervisors, and airline corporate representatives indicates that Flight 727 has become a case study in how not to handle passenger relations. Ms. Martinez. Captain Harrison addresses her with the formal tone reserved for disciplinary situations. You are hereby suspended from duty pending investigation of passenger safety violations. Please surrender your wings, identification badge, and any airline-issued equipment. The public nature of Rebecca's professional execution sends shockwaves through the cabin. Passengers who witnessed her earlier displays of authority now watch her systematic dismantling with the fascination reserved for dramatic reversals of fortune. The same uniform that gave her power to humiliate Grant Thompson now marks her for professional destruction. Rebecca's hands shake as she unpins the silver wings from her uniform jacket. The small piece of metal, earned through months of training and 8 years of service, represents not just employment, but identity. Flight attendants don't simply work for airlines, they embody the profession through their presentation, their authority, their responsibility for passenger safety. Captain, I was following security protocols. Rebecca protests, her voice carrying the desperation of someone watching their world collapse in real time. The passenger was carrying an unidentified device and became argumentative when I enforced regulations. Admiral Thompson, now standing beside his son's seat and monitoring Grant's improved breathing, responds with the quiet authority that shapes federal policy. Miss Martinez, the device you destroyed was a standard albuterol inhaler, clearly labeled with prescription information and protected under federal medical accommodation laws. Your actions violated Section 121.305 of aviation regulations that I helped draft. The specific regulatory citation cuts through Rebecca's protests with surgical precision. Admiral Thompson doesn't engage in emotional arguments or personal attacks. He simply states facts with the authority of someone who shapes the legal framework governing American aviation. FAA investigator Sandra Williams boards the aircraft with the methodical approach of federal law enforcement. Her 20-year career investigating aviation incidents has taught her to document everything, assume nothing, and focus on regulatory compliance rather than personal drama. The thick folder in her hands already contains Rebecca's employment history, disciplinary record, and the preliminary incident report filed by Admiral Thompson. Ms. Martinez, I'm Investigator Williams with the Federal Aviation Administration. I need to inform you that your actions regarding the destruction of prescribed medical equipment constitute potential violations of federal aviation safety regulations, disability accommodation requirements, and civil rights statutes. Each charge carries career-ending implications. Aviation safety violations can result in permanent industry blacklisting. Disability accommodation violations invoke federal civil rights enforcement. The combination creates legal jeopardy that extends far beyond employment consequences. Rebecca's supervisor, Janet Coleman, arrives with the airline's crisis management team and the exhausted expression of someone whose peaceful Sunday has become professional catastrophe. In her 15 years managing flight attendant operations, Coleman has handled passenger complaints, medical emergencies, and occasional discipline issues. But federal investigations involving military officials represent uncharted territory that threatens multiple careers. "Rebecca, what the hell happened here?" Coleman asks, though her tone suggests she already knows the situation is beyond salvage. The question triggers Rebecca's final attempt at justification. "I was protecting flight safety by enforcing device restrictions. The passenger became argumentative, and I had to maintain cabin security." Admiral Thompson responds by producing his phone, which displays crystal-clear video footage captured by multiple passengers. The destruction of Grant's inhaler, Rebecca's dismissive comments about the teenager's medical needs, and her aggressive escalation of the situation play out in high-definition clarity that eliminates any possibility of alternative interpretation. "The evidence is comprehensive," Admiral Thompson states, with the finality of someone accustomed to closing cases. Multiple passengers documented the incident. Air traffic control has the audio recordings. The aircraft's security cameras captured everything. Investigator Williams reviews the passenger recordings with professional detachment. Federal aviation investigations require thorough documentation, and the video evidence provides exactly the kind of clear regulatory violations that result in swift administrative action. "Ms. Martinez, based on preliminary evidence, I am recommending immediate suspension of your aviation certification pending formal hearing. The destruction of medical equipment and discriminatory treatment of passengers constitute serious violations that require federal review." Rebecca's professional world collapses with bureaucratic efficiency. The aviation certification that allows her to work as flight crew will be suspended within hours. The incident report will be distributed to every major airline, creating an industry-wide blacklist that effectively ends her career in commercial aviation. But Admiral Thompson isn't finished. His military training in strategic planning extends beyond immediate tactical victories to long-term systemic change. Rebecca's punishment serves justice, but preventing future incidents requires institutional reform. "Investigator Williams, I'm recommending comprehensive review of training protocols, supervision procedures, and accountability measures for all airline personnel. This incident reveals systemic failures that endanger passenger safety. The broader implications send tremors through the airline's corporate structure. Admiral Thompson's recommendations carry the weight of federal oversight authority. His proposed reforms will require industry-wide policy changes, enhanced training programs, and strengthened accountability measures that prevent future Rebecca Martinez incidents. Grant Thompson, his breathing now stabilized thanks to backup medication provided by a passenger who witnessed the emergency, watches his father's systematic dismantling of Rebecca's career with mixed emotions. The teenager's natural empathy conflicts with his sense of justice, creating the complex feelings that characterize moral victories. "Dad," Grant says quietly, "I just wanted to breathe normally." Admiral Thompson's response reveals the difference between personal revenge and institutional responsibility. "Son, this isn't about punishment. It's about ensuring no other passenger faces what you experienced. Sometimes individual accountability serves broader justice." Rebecca Martinez leaves Flight 727 under federal escort, her airline career effectively ended, her professional reputation destroyed, her future in aviation terminated. The same authority she wielded against Grant Thompson now works against her with the efficiency of institutional accountability. The passengers who witnessed the entire drama understand they have seen more than customer service failure. They have watched the intersection of individual prejudice and systemic power, personal accountability and institutional justice, immediate consequences, and long-term reform. 6 months after Flight 727 returned to the gate in Atlanta, the ripple effects of Rebecca Martinez's 30 minutes of unchecked authority continue to reshape American aviation policy. The incident that began with a destroyed inhaler has evolved into comprehensive industry reform that touches every aspect of passenger rights and crew accountability. The Grant Thompson Protocol, implemented across all major American airlines, establishes clear procedures for medical accommodation, mandatory de-escalation training, and instant accountability measures for discriminatory treatment. Flight attendants now receive 40 hours of additional training focused on cultural sensitivity, medical emergency recognition, and passenger rights protection. Grant Thompson himself has become an unlikely spokesperson for passenger advocacy, speaking at congressional hearings and industry conferences about the intersection of air travel and civil rights. His testimony before the House Transportation Committee resulted in bipartisan legislation strengthening federal oversight of airline personnel training and passenger protection. "I never wanted to be the face of aviation reform," Grant told the packed congressional hearing room. "I just wanted to visit my grandmother safely. But if my experience prevents other families from facing discrimination at 30,000 feet, then something positive came from that terrible day." The scholarship fund established by the airline, part of their settlement with the Thompson family, now provides educational opportunities for students pursuing careers in aviation safety, civil rights law, and healthcare advocacy. Grant received the fund's first full scholarship to pursue aerospace engineering at MIT, where he plans to focus on cabin safety systems and emergency medical equipment design. Admiral Thompson's recommendations resulted in the most comprehensive aviation personnel reforms since 9/11. The new oversight framework includes Passenger Bill of Rights enforcement, mandatory bias training, real-time incident reporting, and federal review of all discrimination complaints. Airlines that fail to meet the enhanced standards face federal sanctions that include route restrictions and certification reviews. Rebecca Martinez's professional destruction serves as a cautionary tale throughout the industry. Her termination, certification suspension, and industry blacklisting demonstrate the career-ending consequences of discriminatory treatment. The video documentation of her actions has become a training tool used in crew education programs, showing exactly how unchecked authority and personal bias can destroy both passenger safety and professional careers. The broader cultural impact extends beyond aviation policy into discussions of institutional racism, authority abuse, and accountability in service industries. Grant's story has been featured in documentaries, academic studies, and civil rights curricula that examine how individual incidents reveal systemic problems requiring comprehensive solutions. Eleanor Thompson, Grant's grandmother, recovered from her illness and attended his high school graduation 6 months later. The family gathering that almost never happened because of Rebecca's actions became a celebration of resilience, justice, and the power of institutional accountability to protect individual dignity. Admiral Thompson continues his work in aviation security with enhanced focus on passenger protection and crew accountability. His experience watching his son's humiliation from 30 rows away has informed policy recommendations that strengthen both security protocols and civil rights protections. The airline industry, initially resistant to the enhanced oversight and training requirements, has discovered that the reforms improve both passenger satisfaction and employee professional development. Flight attendants report feeling better prepared to handle difficult situations, while passengers express increased confidence in airline personnel training and accountability. Grant's destroyed inhaler, photographed and documented as evidence in multiple federal investigations, has become a symbol of how small acts of cruelty can catalyze significant institutional change. The image appears in civil rights museums, advocacy materials, and policy documents that examine the intersection of personal prejudice and professional responsibility. Every day, in airports across America, passengers board aircraft trusting that airline personnel will prioritize their safety, dignity, and well-being above personal bias or misguided authority. The story of Grant Thompson and Rebecca Martinez reminds us that this trust requires constant vigilance, immediate accountability, and the courage to speak truth to power regardless of uniform or institutional position. You have choices when witnessing injustice unfold before your eyes. You can remain silent, hoping someone else will intervene. You can document the incident while avoiding personal involvement. Or you can become the voice that transforms a moment of cruelty into an opportunity for justice and institutional change. The passengers aboard Flight 727 who recorded Rebecca's actions didn't just capture evidence, they provided the documentation that enabled comprehensive reform. Their phones became instruments of accountability that protected not just Grant Thompson, but countless future passengers who will benefit from enhanced training and oversight protocols. Consider the power you possess in your daily interactions with service industry workers, authority figures, and vulnerable individuals who may lack the institutional connections that ultimately protected Grant. Every witness to discrimination faces the choice between comfortable silence and uncomfortable truth-telling. Admiral Thompson's presence on that flight was coincidental, but his response was strategic. He understood that individual accountability serves broader justice, that personal vindication must contribute to systemic change, that protecting his son required protecting all passengers facing similar treatment. The real challenge isn't identifying obvious villains like Rebecca Martinez. It's recognizing the subtle biases, unchecked assumptions, and institutional blind spots that enable discrimination to flourish in environments where authority figures face minimal accountability. Your voice matters. Your witness matters. Your willingness to challenge injustice, whether captured on phone cameras or documented in formal complaints, contributes to the institutional memory that shapes policy, training, and cultural change. In a world where Rebecca Martinez represents the abuse of unchecked authority, be someone's Admiral Thompson, because every passenger deserves to reach their destination safely, with dignity intact and civil rights protected. That's not just the responsibility of parents, officials, or advocates. It's the responsibility of all of us who share the journey.